If you've ever walked the streets of Lafayette or swallowed a spoonful of authentic gumbo, you've probably felt the weight of a legendary history. We've always been told that the Cajuns of Louisiana are the direct, unbroken descendants of a few thousand French farmers who were exiled from Canada in the 1750s. For generations, the story was simple. You were Acadian. You came from a specific province in France like Poitou or Anjou. You moved to Nova Scotia, and then you were forced down to the bayous where you kept your bloodline pure and your culture intact. It is a beautiful, tragic, and heroic story. But geneticists have just released the largest study of Acadian and Cajun DNA ever conducted, and the results have sent a shockwave through every kitchen and dance hall in Louisiana. It turns out that the French part of the Cajun identity is a massive biological puzzle that doesn't fit together the way the history books said it would. When the scientists analyzed the genetic markers of modern Cajuns, they didn't find a match for any single province in France. In fact, they found a phantom genome, a combination of DNA that shouldn't exist based on the official records. Today, we are diving deep into the secret history written in the blood of the bayou, because it turns out the Cajuns are not who we thought they were, and their real origin story is far more mysterious than a simple boat ride from France. To understand why this is such a groundbreaking discovery, you have to understand the legend of the Le Grand Déranmé. The story goes that the Acadians were a homogeneous group of French peasants who settled in what is now Nova Scotia. In 1755, the British forcibly removed them, and eventually, these refugees found a new home in the swamps of Louisiana. Because the Cajun community was so isolated for 200 years, marrying within their own small villages and speaking their own dialect of French, they were considered a genetic goldmine for scientists. They were thought to be a closed loop, a perfect window back into 18th century France. But when the researchers started comparing modern Cajun DNA to the DNA of people living in France today, the map didn't line up. If the Cajuns all came from the Poitou region as the ledgers suggest, their DNA should be a 99% match for the people still living there. Instead, the match was incredibly low. The Cajun genome looked less like a French province, and more like a global crossroads that had been erased from the history books. The first big mystery the scientists encountered was the southwestern shift. In most DNA tests, French ancestry is very distinct from Spanish or Italian ancestry, but the Cajun samples showed a massive Mediterranean signal that is completely absent from the regions of France where the Acadians were supposed to have originated. For years, historians assumed this was just a bit of mixing after the Acadians arrived in Louisiana and met the Spanish colonists. But the genetic timing tells a different story. This Mediterranean DNA was already baked into the Acadian bloodline before they ever left Canada. This means that the original Acadians weren't just French farmers. They were a secret mixture of sailors, merchants, and refugees from all over the Atlantic world, who had been hiding out in the Canadian wilderness for a century, blending together into a new kind of human being that the French crown didn't even recognize. This discovery changes everything we know about the purity of the Acadian line. It turns out that Acadia wasn't just a French colony. It was a 17th century melting pot. The DNA shows clear evidence of Portuguese, Basque, and even North African markers that date back to the 1600s. Why was this hidden? Because in the eyes of the Catholic Church and the French government, you had to be a pure French subject to hold land. The Acadians likely kept their diverse backgrounds a secret to survive under the colonial system. By the time they reached Louisiana, they had been calling themselves purely French for so long that they actually believed it. But the DNA remembers what the tax collectors forgot. Then there is the founding mother mystery. When we look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down strictly from mother to child, we see something even more startling. In most European populations, you see a wide variety of maternal lineages. But in the Cajun population, almost 75% of the people descend from a tiny handful of women. This is what scientists call a genetic bottleneck. However, here's the twist. When the scientists tried to trace those specific women back to France, they couldn't find them. Those specific maternal lines have practically vanished from modern France. This suggests one of two things. Either these women belonged to a subgroup of French people that were completely wiped out in Europe, or, more likely, these founding mothers were never French to begin with. The study hints that many of the original Acadian women were actually from undocumented groups who were already present in North America, blending into the French community so seamlessly that their true origins were lost within a generation. This brings us to the most controversial part of the study, The hidden indigenous signal. For a long time, there has been a debate in Louisiana about how much the Acadians mixed with the native tribes they encountered. Many families have legends of a Native American princess in their woodpile, but official histories often downplayed this. The DNA evidence, however, provides a much more nuanced reality. The researchers found that while the amount of native DNA in modern Cajuns is relatively small, the frequency is incredibly high. This means that almost every single Cajun has a tiny, microscopic fragment of indigenous North American DNA. This isn't from one princess, it's from a massive, systemic integration that happened during the earliest days of the Acadia settlement in the 1600s. The Acadians weren't just neighbors with the native people, they were becoming them. By the time they were exiled to Louisiana, they were already a hybrid population. So why don't the Cajuns match any single French province? It's because the Cajuns are the result of accelerated evolution. When you take a diverse group of people, Basque fishermen, French farmers, Portuguese sailors, and indigenous women, and you trap them in a remote wilderness for 4 generations, their DNA starts to fix into a new, unique signature. They created a synthetic ancestry. By the time the British arrived to deport them, the Acadians were genetically more similar to each other than they were to their own cousins back in Europe. They had become a biological island. When you test a Cajun today, you aren't looking at a Frenchman in exile. You are looking at a unique American subspecies that was forged in the cold of Canada and tempered in the heat of the Louisiana swamp. The study also looked at the Louisiana recombination. After the Acadians arrived in the bayous, their DNA underwent another massive shift. In the 1800s, Louisiana was a chaotic mix of French Creoles, Spanish settlers, German farmers from the German coast, and Islenos from the Canary Islands. The history books say the Cajuns stayed in their own communities and didn't mix. But the DNA shows that Cajunization was a powerful force. People from all these different backgrounds started marrying into the Acadian families. But because the Acadian culture was so dominant, because the food was so good and the music was so infectious, these outsiders stopped being German or Spanish and started calling themselves Cajun. The DNA shows that modern Cajuns have a higher percentage of German DNA than most people in the neighboring southern states. There are thousands of people in Louisiana with names like Scheck Snyder or Himmel, who are genetically German but culturally 100% Cajun. The Acadian identity essentially swallowed the other groups, replacing their history with the legend of the exile. This leads to a fascinating realization. The modern Cajun is actually more European and more diverse than the original Acadians were. The Cajun we know today isn't just a descendant of the refugees. They are a masterpiece of biological engineering that combined the survivors of the Canadian exile with the adventurous spirits of the colonial Gulf Coast. The reason you can't find a match in France is that the Cajun was made in America. They are one of the few populations on Earth where a cultural identity was so strong that it actually reshaped the genetics of an entire region. But what about the people who stayed in France? After the exile, some Acadians actually went back to the motherland. They settled in places like Nantes and Belle-Île-en-Mer. Scientists tested their descendants too. And here is the kicker. Those French Acadians don't match the Louisiana Cajuns at all. Even though they share the same surnames and the same history of exile, 200 years of living in different environments has caused their DNA to diverge. The French branch looks more and more like their French neighbors, while the Louisiana branch has developed a set of genetic markers that are completely unique to the Gulf Coast. This proves that environment and assortative mating, the tendency of people to choose partners who look or act like them, can change a population's genetic profile in an incredibly short amount of time. This study also sheds light on the Cajun resilience. The researchers found that Cajuns have a significantly higher frequency of certain genes related to immune system response. This makes sense when you think about the selection pressure they faced. To survive the journey from Canada to the Caribbean, and then into the mosquito-infested swamps of South Louisiana, you had to have a steel-plated immune system. The people who didn't have these genes simply didn't survive to become ancestors. What we call Cajun culture is actually a collection of the survivors of a biological gauntlet. The DNA we see today is the winner's script. It is the genetic code of the toughest, most adaptable people from 20 different European and American groups. There is also the isolation paradox. We usually think that isolation leads to inbreeding and genetic health problems. And while there are certain rare conditions that are more common in the Cajun community due to the founder effect, the study found that, overall, the Cajun genome is remarkably healthy and heterozygous, meaning it has a lot of healthy variation. This is because the Cajun umbrella was always open. Even though they lived in remote bayous, they were constantly absorbing new blood from travelers, sailors, and neighboring settlers. The secret to the Cajun survival wasn't purity. It was the ability to take anyone from any background, feed them some jambalaya, and turn them into a Cajun within one generation. This genetic revelation has a deep impact on how we view family history. If you are a Cajun and you've been looking for your original village in France, the DNA suggests you might be looking for a ghost. Your ancestors weren't just from one village. They were a collection of outliers who came together to create something new. The Cajun DNA is a record of a world that no longer exists. A world where the lines between French, Spanish, Indigenous, and Basque were blurred by the necessity of survival in a new world. The research team used a technology called haplotype sharing analysis. Instead of just looking at individual markers, they looked at long sentences of DNA. What they found was that the Cajun sentences are long and highly decorated with New World markers. When they compared these to the sentences in the DNA of people in central France, the difference was like comparing a modern American novel to a medieval French poem. They use some of the same words, but the structure, the rhythm, and the story are completely different. The Cajun genome is a rebirth. It is what happens when a group of people is torn away from their roots and forced to grow new ones in a completely different soil. This also explains why Cajun French is so different from standard European French. Language and DNA often move together. Just as the Cajun DNA absorbed Spanish, German, and indigenous influences, the language did the same. We've always treated the language as a corrupted version of French, but the science shows that both the language and the DNA are actually enhanced versions of the original. They are more complex, more durable, and more suited to the environment they inhabit. The Cajun is not a lesser version of the Frenchman. They are a next-generation evolution of the Atlantic wanderer. One of the most emotional parts of the study for many participants was the reconnection with the indigenous. For generations, many Cajuns felt that their connection to the land was based on their status as European settlers. But seeing the indigenous markers in their own blood changed that perspective. It showed that they don't just live on the land, they are of the land. Their ancestors didn't just conquer the swamp. They merged with the people who had been there for thousands of years. This genetic bridge provides a sense of belonging that transcends the tragedy of the exile. It turns the Cajun story from one of displacement to one of integration. The study also looked at the Acadian diaspora in other parts of the world, like the French neutrals who were sent to England or the families that ended up in the Falkland Islands. In every case, the Acadian DNA behaved like a chameleon. It adapted to its new surroundings, picking up local markers while keeping that core refugee signature. But none of these other groups became as distinct or as successful as the Louisiana Cajuns. The bayou was the perfect incubator. The heat, the isolation, and the unique colonial politics of Louisiana allowed the Cajun genome to cook in a way that didn't happen anywhere else. As the data was finalized, the scientists realized that the Cajun identity is one of the best examples of cultural genetic shielding ever documented. This is when a group's culture is so strong that it protects their genetic identity even when they are surrounded by millions of outsiders. Even after the Americanization of the 20th century, when the French language was banned in schools and the bayous were opened up by highways, the Cajun genetic signature remained distinct. They didn't blend into the American South. The American South had to adapt to them. This Cajun DNA study is more than just a scientific paper. It is a liberation of the Cajun people from a history that was too small for them. They aren't just the children of the exile. They are the children of the Atlantic. They are the descendants of every sailor who ever hopped a boat for a better life, every farmer who survived a Canadian winter, and every indigenous person who shared their knowledge of the swamp. They are a global tribe that just happened to settle in the most beautiful corner of Louisiana. If you are a Cajun listening to this, or if you have Cajun friends, take a moment to look at the complexity of that heritage. Your blood is a map of the world. It is a story of survival that is so intense it literally changed your biology. You don't match any single province in France because you were meant for something bigger than a single province. You are the result of a $980 million biological investment by history itself. The phantom genome of the bayou is a badge of honor. It is the proof that when you try to erase a group of people, they don't just disappear, they change, they adapt. They become something that the world has never seen before. The scientists are now using the Cajun data to help understand how founder populations can be used to track the movement of diseases and the evolution of the human immune system. But for the people of Louisiana, the value of the study is much more personal. It is the final piece of the puzzle. It explains why they feel so different from the rest of the country. It explains why their music, their food, and their spirit are so unique. It's not just in the air, it's in the DNA. As we look at the future of genetic research, the Cajun study will stand as a warning to historians. It shows that you cannot rely on labels and ledgers to tell the true story of a people. Paper can be burned, and names can be changed. But the DNA is a silent witness that never lies. The Cajuns of today are a testament to the power of the human spirit to reinvent itself in the face of absolute disaster. They are a miracle of the modern world, a population that was born from fire and ice to become the heartbeat of the South. So, the next time someone tells you that Cajuns are just French people in the swamp, tell them about the phantom genome. Tell them about the Basque sailors, the Portuguese merchants, the German farmers, and the indigenous mothers who all conspired to create the most unique population in North America. The DNA has been cracked, the secret is out, and the Cajun story is officially much bigger than we ever dreamed. The bayou is singing with the voices of 1,000 different ancestors, all blended into the single powerful melody of the Acadian heart. Stay curious, keep digging into your own history, and remember that sometimes the most exciting discoveries are the ones that prove we are much more connected to the whole world than we ever realized.